Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm just going through the books I've been reading this week. Realise this lighting's a little bit funky, not in a kind of cool way, but just a little bit off. It's either this or a flickering light, so here we go. And so yeah, the books I've read this week, it's been, again, like an interesting mix of books, and there are still a few that I'm kind of partway through that I'm going to save for another week. But let's get started. First up, I read Hanne Ørstavik's Ti Amo, and I've not, excuse this, basically like a sticker accidentally got stuck to it, and I was sort of trying to very carefully take it off and ended up destroying part of the cover. But anyway, Ti Amo is a book that I just think is just really beautiful and stunning in so many ways. It's my first time reading anything by her, and this sort of is translated by Martin Aitken, and I think what's really quite special is the way that over so few pages, I mean, it's not even 100 pages, this book really goes into the depths of the sort of the end stage of a relationship where a partner is sort of about to die. And that sounds incredibly dark and sad, and in many ways a large part of the book is, but it also manages to find something really quite special in the folds between those things. So it's this really stunning book that I think just really kind of goes into it. So essentially, yeah, let's start with the story. Essentially, yeah, so she is watching as her husband starts sort of going through his last moments, and her observations are kind of how she tries to interact with him, how this can all work in a situation where these two people are completely lost about what everything's going to look like next. It's really quite poignant, I think, and really very tenderly observed. She will watch as he is sort of struggling to do something that he used to find quite easy, and she is suddenly trying to adapt to his energy levels. And she sometimes finds that when she's talking about her own energy levels, there's a complicating factor because she is both tired emotionally and from sort of physically kind of trying to look after him, but also if she's just tired more generally, she feels bad that kind of doesn't, she's saying all of this in front of somebody who is going through much worse. And so really what happens instead is these sort of reminiscences of living, going back over a life in just the most poignant way. And I think it's just so stunningly observed. Something really quite intoxicating about the way this is written, I found. And it's sort of fiction, sort of non-fiction. It sits in this weird blurred line. She talks about it in the book as sort of writing this book or writing this novel, but at the same time it's, she references herself as an author and all the books she's written before, and so there's something quite interesting going on where this really blurs lines of what genre it is in a way that I think is just so brilliant. Next up, on maybe a similar note in some ways, I read August Blue by Deborah Levy, and I have read one of hers before, Swimming Home, but had no real concept of how to approach this book. I didn't really even read the blurb much, and so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And I really enjoyed this. I think it's quite a hard book to pin down in many ways. The central narrator is essentially, she's just not long come from a fairly traumatic event for her. She's a pianist and she performed on stage and things went wrong, and so she's convinced that the world hates her and she never really wants to pick up a piano again and pick up a piano, as you do. She never wants to really play the piano again, and so she's kind of going through that, but at the same time she has this sort of internal monologue that's sort of going on around finding out more about her parents, because her birth parents, because she was adopted, and so she has this sort of other thing going on in her head of finding out really who she is. And in the meantime she's traveling across various locations, mostly London, Paris and parts of Italy, particularly sort of Sardinia. And while she's doing so, she keeps on having these little moments of reflection about there's a woman who she's convinced is following her throughout these cities, and there's somebody else who she's convinced is following her, or that she's seeing all these patterns in everything. And so she's this very interesting narrator where she's almost unreliable in several different ways. It's this sort of stream of consciousness almost, this kind of monologue that's going on, and she's so convinced of things in her world, but she will say something and then very quickly move along to something else that seems completely unconnected, but in her mind these things are entirely connected. You know, watching somebody buy these little horse toys, and watching somebody order in a certain way in a cafe or wear a certain dress or whatever, all of these trigger these other little memories in her mind, and so she's constantly on these kind of going down these little rabbit holes. And so at times this book can feel quite hard to follow, but it's a relatively short book, and I actually think what actually worked for me in terms of how I read it was sort of reading it in basically two big chunks. And I think that helped because you kind of keep the rhythm of her inner thoughts and follow the kind of what otherwise would be a plot that doesn't really seem to make sense at times. But actually there's an internal logic to it that is hers entirely. And I think that the mastery of someone like Deborah Levy is in being able to write this very disjointed, disconnected, unreliable character in a way that is so well captured in terms of voice, but also just has this real rhythm and structure and focus going forward. So it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, but it is, and it's being driven towards a direction that is at times really quite tricky and unnerving. And so I really enjoyed this, even though I find it quite hard in some ways to pin down what exactly happened. I think it's a really interesting book. It kind of reminded me a teeny bit of the film, I'm getting a bit American here, the film Tar, and featuring Cate Blanchett. And I think for different reasons, partly because of the music link, but there's something about the way that both these characters move through their worlds that is so sort of determined that they are right and that they're seeing things in a specific way that I found fascinating. So there we go. Next up, on a lighter note, I read Bored Gay Werewolf by Tony Santorella, and which is firstly like the best title. I mean, it's just great. And essentially the title is very true to what is happening. We have our character at the heart of this, Brian, who is he basically finds out that he's a werewolf. It's not written in a kind of very fantasy heavy kind of way. It's not kind of, it's kind of a fairly regular story of a sort of bit of a somebody who's a bit stuck in various parts of their life. Is kind of, he's not doing what he wants to. He's not really feeling like he's achieving anything. He kind of keeps on feeling like he's messing up everything. But it's kind of all of that, plus he's a werewolf. And so there are just some really funny moments in this book. There's a whole like sex scene where at one point a dog is trying to bite his ankle while it's all happening, which was genuinely, laugh out loud funny for me. It features some just like great lines. Like at one point he talks about being a gay frog in a boiling fag hag pot or something like that. It's the weirdest description, but it's incredible. And it's just very, very well observed. I think I really enjoyed it just on an absolutely silly and absurd level. Because it just kind of goes there for the sake of it. It kind of just gives itself the liberty to sort of play around and be silly, but equally at the heart of it, it's sort of a bit of a twist on the classic fantasy genre. And so I just really enjoyed it for that reason. I just think this was just really good fun. And I listened to it as an audiobook as well, which was a delight. Because it's just, sometimes you just want to walk and have somebody tell you about these silly things. So yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it. Next up, I read Camp by Paul Baker. And so this is a non-fiction book. Paul Baker is somebody whose work I have really, really enjoyed. He writes a lot about sort of various parts of queer culture generally, but sort of a few other bits and pieces here and there. He wrote some really great work on Polari, the sort of hidden and sort of former kind of queer slang, essentially, or language, or it sits in a weird place between those things, but it's I've always kind of loved his work, so I was really, really excited to read Camp, and this did not disappoint. So this is firstly sort of trying to pin down what camp is as a concept, and He spends a good amount of time at the beginning of the book doing so, which I think is necessary because it's such a slippery concept, but one of those things where when you see it, you know it. As with many human things, some of the things where we instinctively know it best are the hardest to describe. And so he talks about camp as this sort of, these attempts at kind of grandeur and these, the silliness of puncturing like power and all of these things, and then he goes on to talk about kind of camp icons through time. And so sometimes those are people who use campness within activism. Sometimes those are film stars. Sometimes those are sort of celebrities and singers and various other things. But I think what really brings this together as a really strong book for me is the way that he takes these concepts of what could be seen as quite a frivolous topic of kind of just like, hey, look how fun it is just to talk about camp things and how silly and wonderful this all is, but manages to morph it into something much bigger, which is sort of how camp has sort of shaped culture, has been a way of resisting things within the world, and how it offers sort of this really interesting outlook about how we can celebrate joy and how we can kind of laugh at the things that scare us. And so I just think it's a really brilliant book that I just had the most fun reading as well. So yeah, it's been a good one for that. And that brings me to the end of the books I've read this week. I think there are some really exciting books on the horizon that I've kind of have arrived that I need to catch up on. So those will come up in the next few weeks, hopefully. And the Booker is coming up soon. So my reading will also be a little bit of everything I want to read before the Booker comes and like steamrolls over that, but also maybe reading some books that I think may make the list. Also, I realized that, so the Booker video I put out, I scheduled it, I recorded it at the end of May, just before I left the UK to go away for a few weeks. And so there have been some books like August Blue that I've now since read, and which I think I did put on my list, but other books that I've read since, like The Late Americans by Brandon Taylor, that I'm also curious about whether that will make the list. So who knows? Lots of books, but let's see. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about the books I've read this week. Take care and speak to you all soon. Have a good week. Bye-bye.